Thank you very much. I hope the microphone is working. It sounds as though it is. I want to acknowledge the presence. We are very honored to have the Honorable Lois Mitchell, Lieutenant Governor of Alberta.
Oh, wow.
Lois. She's not only a dear personal friend, but she's been very involved with the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. It was about 7 or 8 years ago, because she and Doug sponsored a study that we did on the influence of sports on new Canadians and how to reach new Canadians through sports. And she's been a stalwart supporter of the Clarkson Cup also. Thank you, Lois, and thank you for being here. Well, we had a very interesting morning, and I have to say that this wonderful way of looking at people and things is both disorienting, because you know there's people behind you, but also so welcoming, because you can see them reflecting on you and also seeing the people that you can't see. That's what's kind of interesting about it. I've got a wonderful group of people up here with me, and I'm very honored to introduce Brad Zumwalt, whom I think many of you know. We first met when I was Governor General. We came out here in 2001, and we met him when he and his wife Tanya invited us to their house with a group of friends who were with social venture partnerships, and that was one of the most exciting kind of things that we had heard about at that point. And he's the president of Zinc Ventures and a prominent Calgarian that I think many of you know. We also have His Worship, Naheed Nenshi, dear old friend who came first to Rideau Hall with his group in, I think, about 2002. He was 25. That'll tell you about the group and about him and a lot of the people around him. And we've kept up with him ever since. And we knew he wouldn't be just a wastrel. We just knew that.
What?
Wastrel, W-A-S.
No, I know what it means. I'm surprised you're making the conclusion that that is not what I am.
Oh, no, I'm drawing the conclusion, okay? We'll leave yours till later. And Natan Obed, who's the president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the national Inuit leader. Welcome. Very happy to have you here. And Pam Krause, president and CEO of the Sexual Health Center. So we had a very good start off this morning, I think, with the discussions that we had. And one of the most interesting things that was brought up, and we'll just kind of kick it off here, was somebody from Pam's organization said that institutions were the things that were kind of letting us down. We're talking about people, we're talking about how we are involved with each other, how we have, and in the very early discussions at 9 o'clock, we heard about compassion, we heard about listening to other people, but that the institutions somehow lag, and that they could behave better, to put it as your mother would say, and that we perhaps could genuinely and must rethink them. That the impetus for doing things, the impetus for volunteering, the impetus for being part of each other is in all of us, and is in Calgary, very alive, shown during the floods and after, shown continually, the White Hatters at the airports, a unique kind of place with a unique history. But must we genuinely rethink all of that? That's one of the things I want to put on the table from this morning, because we got quite far this morning with a number of our questions and discussions. And the whole idea of diversity was, in a way, I thought, in our discussion, put into question. What is diversity? Who represents it? What are we? Do we talk about it and yet not understand it thoroughly? Are we confused? And I have to say, I'm going to just say that I come from a generation, and I'll quote Margaret Atwood here, who was at our 6 Degrees in September, and somebody challenged her. People do challenge, even Margaret Atwood, and said, "How can you say that?" And she said, "I can say it because I'm old." And so I'm going to say this because I'm old, which is that diversity to us as young women, and Margaret Atwood and I are exact contemporaries at university, we've been friends since we were 18, we thought with the second wave of feminism that everything was going to be fine. And then the pill came, and we thought everything is going to be fine. And women are going to take their place, and we will just float to the top, but everything will be fine and we'll be half of everything, or maybe more than half of everything. And I have to say that we know right now that that is not the case. And we see that it is vastly unfair, that things have not happened as we wanted. So what, where, and how did we go wrong? The impetus was there, the emotions were there. We can apply this to things like volunteering, to doing good, to welcoming, and so on. But what happened? What goes wrong down the path? So, you know, we have to think about diversity. I'm not like you, and you're not like me. But where does that balance fall? Where are we with all of that? So I'd just like to start out by asking Brad, who's been involved not only with his fellow citizens, couples who are married and have goals of their own for their families, building their lives, building successful lives for them and their families, looking outside themselves and saying we want to be involved with something that is worthwhile while keeping together as a group, as a family, and as groups together as families. So where are we with this? Are the institutions lagging behind where we are in our thoughts and hopes and emotions?
Right. You know, on the institutions, the one spot that that I would say we could do some work on in this nation is really letting the institutions craft and talk about vision. The discussion today about resilient communities and resiliency is good. But I keep feeling this question in me that is resilient in order to what? Like, what do we have to withstand and bear up against so that we can accomplish what vision? I don't have a sense that across the nation or in this province or in our city, we give the institutions enough room to really speak vision to us, to listen to what we want to accomplish as a country, and then say, this is the vision. This is why we need to work together through diversity and to stay resilient and to accomplish these things. This is what we're after. And so with respect to your question about institutions, then yes, I think I would be eager to listen and understand what our vision is as a country, as a province, and as a city. And I think we're very close to those things, but sometimes just reluctant to nail it down and repeat it year after year after year and know what we're striving for. So I think there's a new role for institutions to craft that. We do a little bit of work in Calgary with a very grassroots group called the Rainforce Group that is something very similar to this. Gets people together every Wednesday in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, just to share and meet each other and make these connections. And the purpose of that is to craft, you know, the kind of city with the cadence of a weekly meeting where we're trying to get to. So the institutions, the people in the institutions, I think are all well-meaning and doing the right things, but I think the institutions themselves could aspire and step into that role of really talking about vision for us in our city and in our province and in our country.
Nathan, what about institutions and the Inuit you're dealing with? You are part of an institution because you are the president of the organization. You deal with the institution called the Government of Canada. You deal with the other organizations, structures. What is your view of the institutions and the way in which they can react to what are your desires, hopes, dreams, aspirations?
First off, there's an Inuit democracy in Canada. That's probably something that a lot of you wouldn't expect, and a lot of institutions don't accept. The idea that we have mobilized since the early 1970s, and we have settled comprehensive land claim agreements, we have elections for our four Inuit leaders across Inuit Nunagat, and then they elect a national leader, and that's me. And then we work with the Government of Canada, we work with provinces and territories to implement land claims, to also to uphold the rights that we have, whether it's through the Canadian Constitution or through international human rights law. The fact that this all exists is something that is still very new to Canadians, and Canadian institutions, especially government, do not accept. they may accept parts of it. They may accept that there is a land claim in, say, Newfoundland and Labrador. So the government of Newfoundland and Labrador might accept that the Nunatsiavut government exists, and the Labrador Inuit Land Claim Agreement is an agreement that needs to be implemented. But when it comes down to the ultimate respect for another governance, for the fact that there are different levels of power in this country, and Indigenous peoples occupy one of those levels, you can't say that they don't. We do have the right to self-determination. But the idea that institutions in this country would still rather work with us out of a new level of respect, out of reconciliation, out of sympathy, or the goodness of their hearts, or within a political platform, versus the basic respect that we all have. We all respect the right of premiers to lead. We respect the right of the Prime Minister to make decisions within the federal jurisdiction, even if we didn't vote for that Prime Minister. We can't just opt out and say, well, that person does not represent me. I am not going to be Canadian in this moment because I disagree with the Prime Minister. Yet, within Indigenous conversations in this country, nobody or very few Canadians are willing to accept Inuit self-determination and Inuit democracy and the leadership and the positions that Inuit leadership takes. And then the respect that then turns into a change in policy, a change in legislation, the respect for the intergovernmental space. Provinces and territories fight tooth and nail to not allow for representatives of Indigenous peoples to be at intergovernmental national tables, Council of Federation meetings, First Ministers meetings. Why? Because we aren't there yet. The provinces and territories, and in some cases the federal government, are very happy to dictate to Indigenous peoples who gets to go to those spaces. So when we think about where we are in reconciliation, we have done some amazing things. We've found our way, but people are still holding back on that fundamental principle of accepting that there is a certain level of Indigenous self-determination, democracy, and power that exists in this country that has to be respected, and that has to come through provinces, territories, municipalities, the federal government, all believing in it, and then looking to those institutions of Indigenous governance to work with them and respect their power.
Do you think the basis, and I'm asking us all really, there seems to be a basis here when you talk about lack of respect. Lack of respect comes out of a certain kind of fear. There's fear, there's a level of fear.
Absolutely.
And what do you think that fear would be?
I think for sure there is a fear of what's going to happen next. A fear is who is coming up now and who is going to lead. And I really had an aha moment during this last session around resilience and institutions, where as a gay person and as a young gay woman, I was always having to go to institutions to ask if I was allowed to walk in the door. And the goal I have in my life is that I don't have to ask, that I get to walk in and be accepted just like everybody else. So I feel like our institutions are stuck in a status quo because of fear. Because of what if they can't respond to us, or what if they can't provide what we need to be able to be resilient as individuals. So I think it makes it mucky for the institutions to actually know what to do.
Well, you run an institution called a city. What do you think?
It's a pretty big one. First of all, let me apologize that I wasn't able to be here this morning, so I'm starting from a bit of a vacuum on this conversation. I'm sure that it would have been far more enlightening than the City Council Committee meeting I was chairing, which is still going on, by the way, without me, thank goodness. I think that I'm really of two minds of this, because on the one hand, having participated in so many conversations like this, never quite like this, except for the last 6 degrees, but so many conversations like this, I worry a lot about the concept of work avoidance. And saying something like, institutions are our problem and must be reformed, is an easy way of saying, we're never going to do anything about anything, I'm just going to complain about it a lot. And so that's always one of my starting points, is that it's far too easy to lay blame far too broadly. And that, in many ways, leads to a situation where people like Pam don't get in there and change the world. Or Nate, how do you pronounce your name properly?
Natan.
Natan.
Yeah.
My Inuit languages are very, very poor. Or people like Natan don't say, you know what? I'm going to do something here. I'm going to change this. People like Ken Terr don't say, never mind that I'm in a wheelchair, I'm going to run for public office, right? So we have to be able to understand that institutions are just people. And people are made up of human beings who have various things they want to do. And if we want to change institutions, if we want to change how our society works, then it's incumbent on us as human beings to do everything within our power to make that happen. So that's my one side. My other side is, of course, they're terribly broken. But the question then becomes, what do we do about that? So I'm looking over Brad's shoulder, and there's this giant banner on the wall, for those that can see it, of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Goals for Sustainable Development. I spent a lot of my time on goal number 11, but it's about municipalities and cities and communities, so you don't have to check. So one of the architects of the Sustainable Development Goals is my friend John MacArthur, a 43-year-old Canadian. And he's just written a paper that has just come out this week out of Brookings about Canada's role in those global goals. And it's very easy for us to think of the Sustainable Development Goals as things for other countries. They're for developing countries. They're for the UN. And even for me, I'm boxed into number 11, which is about cities and communities. But I spend a ton of my time talking about protecting the watershed, which is number 14. I spend a ton of my time talking about how we bring peace in our community, which is number 16. And so on and so on. And so within the world in which I work, and I try to remind City Council of this every single time. I'm not allowed to pray before meetings anymore. It was a Supreme Court decision that I really disagree with. So instead, I secularly pray before meetings. And every time we start a meeting, we start with the land acknowledgement. We talk about the context of the place in which we stand. But I also talk about the importance of the decisions that we're making in terms of building a community for the future. And when we get into a big fight over whether cannabis stores need to be 300 meters or 150 meters from schoolyards, those are important decisions, but they have to be held in that context. What are we building as a human race? What are we building as the world? What are we building as a country, as a province, and as a city? And that's hard. It is so hard. Even today, the horrible committee meeting I was just in was about whether or not Calgary should bid on the 2026 Olympics. And what was fascinating about that is even in that case, in a very constrained decision, my colleagues and I take blame for it, were focused on this tiny little decision over here. And by the way, if we say no to this tiny little decision, which we may well do, then actually we end up saying no to this whole box. And nobody was talking about the box. Nobody was talking about the fact that the 2026 games are being built from the ground up to be a game that involves Indigenous people from the very beginning, and part of the endowment is to encourage Indigenous participation in sport. No one's talking about that. And if council decides that they want to get rid of it because they disagree with this corner over here, and they haven't even had the discussion about what they're saying no to, it's a great example of how our institutions are focused on short-termism. How politics is focused on short-termism, and how placing those short-term decisions in the context of our bigger decisions, closing what I call the say-do gap. We're very good at saying the right things. We're very bad at making daily decisions that lead to that. To me, that's where the reform needs to happen. It's about people not saying, I reject, I'll pick on whoever was speaking earlier, I reject Walmart because I don't like some of the owners. Rather than saying that, how about saying, hey, Walmart is the largest private sector employer in the United States. How can we work with them to use their tremendous buying power and their power as an employer for better rights for working people and supporting wealth-creating entrepreneurs who are producing goods in our communities? So to me, I think that the question of are institutions broken? Yeah, of course they are, but it's a sterile question. The real question is, what do we do to improve our society given what we've got?
Yeah, I guess the only point is, can you get to a certain point only and then you get blocked by the institutions. I mean, this is
Sure.
the thing that we're thinking about in terms of Indigenous peoples and where they would be going from now on, which would be a very, very important decision for Canada and make a great deal of difference in Canada.
But you never, never, never stop, right? If you're blocked by the institution, you run for mayor. If you're blocked by the institution, you become the national leader. If you're blocked by the institution, you make sexual health an incredibly important part of the conversation that we're having across the community. Or, my favorite example, if you're blocked by the institution and we're stuck in an economy that cannot see past the problems that got us here, you create the Rainforest Alliance and you bring everyone every Wednesday for a lunch, you don't feed them lunch. So they're actually focused on their work, which is actually true, right?
That's true.
So you fight it, and it's frustrating as hell. And even when you're the mayor and you can't get this done and you're surrounded by people and you kind of go, learn something, talk to somebody, think about something. It's frustrating as hell. But you never, 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 never can give up, because we have to continue making that work happen every day. 3 years ago, when I stood up at a city council meeting for that secular prayer, I took a deep breath and I said, I am just going to do a land acknowledgement. I don't have permission to do this. It's never been done in this chambers before. And I will just take whatever flack I get. Yeah, I'm making it sound like I'm so courageous for saying 2 sentences, please. I just got up and did it. And now it is, ask Lois Mitchell, do we ever go to anything that doesn't start with a land acknowledgement anymore? It's changed so fast, and it's a tiny thing. But I was sitting down with a Blackfoot elder yesterday who said, do you know how much it means to us that you start every speech with that? So you just keep fighting. You win the little victories, then you win the big victories.
I
So I feel a little passionate about this, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's quite all right. You took a lot of time too, but that's fine.
You're supposed to cut me off, Your Excellency.
No, I'm so nice to you because I knew you when you were a child. The area in which you work, which basically does not deal that much with structures, but do you get funding from government? How far can you go with what you do, and how diversified you can be, and how many people you can bring in, and what prejudices you can overcome?
Well, it's so interesting because when I started at the organization, I always wore jeans. I always sat in the back. I was always mad. Nobody was ever listening to me. And then eventually I thought, or maybe you sit at the table and you wear the suit and you have the conversations with the people who you need to have them with. And it made all the difference in the world. So while we operate outside of big systems, if we aren't integral to systems, how are people going to know what people need? And so with LGBTQ rights, we fought, and in the province of Alberta, every right we gained was through the court system. And it was hard, and it was hard work. But now I sit at a table and I'm recognized as a leader, partly because I'm a lesbian. Like, how the hell did that happen, right? I mean, I literally would not be allowed to go places. And so when you think about if you aren't actually working within the systems, if you're not actually focused on the advocacy part of the systems, but for me, radical activism wasn't getting me far enough. And so I had to shift the way I thought and the way our organization thought about our role in society. And I cannot tell you the pride I take in our mayor considering the work we do important. Like, that never happened even 10 years ago. So I see great value in being part of systems, and I see great value of being that voice at the table. And most importantly, I see my role as being the voice at the table where other people can't have that voice.
What I'm interested in is whether or not you get angry. And if you get angry, how do you allow yourself to show it?
I don't really get angry that much, but I have been very frustrated. And I get most frustrated when the conversations that we do have and the time that we do have with elected leaders or with Canadians in general isn't productive. And when we have an opportunity and it's described to Canadians as an opportunity, but nobody's willing to put the work in to try to figure out how to actually make it work. So this gets to your point as well. So land acknowledgements are a first step, but reconciliation in this country is going to be a lot harder than land acknowledgements. And it's going to take a huge amount of capital investment It's going to take a huge amount of social investment. It's going to take the change in the conversation from the beginning. In the Canadian Arctic, in Inuit Nunangat, we are very lucky to live there. This is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. We see it as our homeland and a place that we are inextricably tied to. Some other people might see it as a wasteland. Some other people might see it as a place that they would never want to go just because it's cold. Often to get to the conversations, I have to get through that initial social back and forth with a bureaucrat, with a minister, with a prime minister, before you even can get to work. And most people on most issues don't have to get through that layer of just introduction that has nothing to do with the work. Often you'll hear the refrain, well, you don't really know the Arctic until you go to it. But people in governments make decisions every day around programs and policies and legislation that they haven't actually lived. They don't have lived experience on everything. So this idea that we can't really figure out how to create good policy for Inuit unless we actually go to Inuit Nunangat, unless we actually see the people in their overcrowded homes, or to see the person with active tuberculosis, that really makes me angry. Because we come to the table with evidence. I accept that I have to do my job through evidence-based, globally informed, and Inuit-specific positions that our organization takes. I feel like that's the only way I can get in the door and have a reasonable conversation with institutions. On the institution side, I have people saying, I don't really know about your issue, and I read this report, but I really have to go there. That really pisses me off. But this is just the way in which the conversation has flowed. We're really comfortable that the fact that there's 300 times the rate of TB in Inuit communities than there is in the rest of Canada, that our suicide rates are between 11 and 25 times the rates of non-Inuit in this country. We're comfortable in it, and that's just the reality. If you're not pushing back against it, you're comfortable with it. So I do get fired up about these things, but personally I have to ensure that I don't lose my own self in all of this. And I'm an optimist, and I also like to converse with people. I like to work through any challenges that we have. And so that's just a fortunate way in which I see the world and I'm able to work on these issues.
Somebody this morning said that we should all have the Truth and Reconciliation report and read all its recommendations. What is it, 57? And that would help us. Would it? If we were suddenly to distribute them all here, would that help?
The TRC recommendations are a point in time, and they are a part of the story. They're a part of the solution. I think that they've been given due notice in relation to just about any other recommendations from any structure, any inquiry. But they were an inquiry that had a very specific purpose in relation to residential schools and how to reverse the horrendous legacy of residential schools in this country for Indigenous peoples and for reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. But it's very specific to answering that question. So there are a host of different things that we have to do, and it would be very unfortunate if the 94 calls to action then became a replacement for implementing land claim agreements, respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all the other things that we have to do in concert to get to the place where we want to be.
Adrian, we're at the 30-minute
Yes.
mark. It's
Would
Charlie
like to
over
have
here.
people join in
Yes.
here.
Marty and I will get on our feet, and we're available for people who would like to
Yes.
start talking, joining the conversation. In the meantime, carry on, of course.
The idea that the TRC would kind of resolve everything, or even the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women those aren't remedies. Those are looking at specific situations for specific awful problems. But they're not, what you're saying is they're not the remedy for anything. And I think often people do tend to think in Canada, once we do something like that, it's kind of over. even if the government does or does not do any recommendations, as they did nothing for the Royal Commission that George Erasmus headed over 20 years ago. Even after we had done all of that and everybody said those were good recommendations, nothing was done.
There's a question back here.
Hello, sorry, my question is about Mayor, is about courageous conversations. I look around this room, and I am a CEO, and I asked myself this morning, where are my colleagues? And there's a few of them in the room, and I asked myself, what was more important for those other CEOs that they're not here? Right, because we have accountabilities. And I think we need to have more courageous conversations. The mayor and I, to be very honest, had one several years ago about ending homelessness. I gave him a report card. And I said, you asked me, how am I doing? I said, well, you're failing, 0, 0, 0, 0. He was livid. Next year, he was into his staff, and I said, we're only 8 years in. Thank God, housing's on your radar now, right? But you heard me, he went back. I came back a year later, how am I doing? Tick, 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 tick. We are not having those courageous conversations, right? We're faking it. And the media can help us put the courageous conversation in. Why aren't you changing? I'm going to say one more thing. Federal government, 23 million sitting in a ministry, Duclos right now, for families with missing children or dead children. 12,000 spent. What the? We have to put things behind what we choose to vote and how we do things. That's us.
Thanks. Another intervention over here.
Hi, following on with the courageous conversations, I've been sort of waiting for an opportunity to bring this up. I think that there's this element of shame. I've been reading a lot of Brené Brown's work, so anybody who's familiar with her work, but I think there's a collective shame that we as individuals feel for the wrongdoings of our ancestors, of the people around us. We brought up maybe with a misconception of other people around us, and while people feel a sense of shame, they can't move forward. Shame blocks our ability to move forward, to see beyond ourselves. We become defensive. And so why aren't people here who should be here? Perhaps they realize they have a prejudice that it just came to them. They realized it's subconscious. It's what they were brought up. They heard their parents saying, their peers at school. And even though they don't really believe it now, they're not really given the opportunity to say, or we don't say to them, it's okay that happened. What's important is that you want to move beyond that. And I think we kind of need to acknowledge that there is this collective shame. And if we say, it's okay that you may once have had this belief, but now you're moving towards reconciliation and growth, I think that people will be a little less defensive and more willing to show up and speak. Yeah.
Can I get this back to you? Can I throw it to you?
I hosted a dinner party where we actually talked about truth and reconciliation, and we talked about residential schools. Not an Indigenous person at the table, but we were having that conversation. Very few people, and they were white and in our community, didn't know about it because it wasn't taught in school. Okay, so that was an issue. We had to start telling the truth. But there was a person at the table who was from South Africa. And she said to me, I'm sorry, let me get this straight. You took Indigenous children away from their families, put them in residential schools, and nobody knows about this, yet everybody knows about apartheidism. Mm-hmm. How did that happen? How did it happen? Until we acknowledge ourselves as people in this country, that it occurred. I wasn't born, but I'm shameful that it happened. Right? But again, the question is not what I do with my past, it's what I do going forward. Right? And I think those are the courageous conversations we need to have. I have had the pleasure of being in Iqaluit, Nunavut. And it was a life-altering moment for me to be humble with elders in their school system. Inuit women, elders in elementary school. This is part of the system there. And I'm thinking, why don't we have that here? Why aren't we learning? Courageous conversations. And again, I fear a little bit about, and I'm sorry, I know we've got politicians in the room, but elections are based on votes. Votes are based on what's public appeal to different people. When are we going to change that kind of system that we're getting the type of leaders into politics who want to lead despite what media says. I mean, it's hard.
Marty, I'll go over there. By all means, anybody on stage, of course, can also jump in.
Is there? Are they going to follow that there? Oh, here we are.
Well,
we have a member of Parliament. Can say, nice to see you.
It's an honor to be here, and thank you for having these important discussions in this room. And I'd like to ask Nahed's opinion on it and the like, but there's a certain thing that politicians have. We want to change things. We want to bring about important work. We want to move forward in what our value systems are. And at the same point in time, there's always the thing, you can't lead from too far out in front. And here's what I mean by that. Sometimes we need the pressure of the community to hold our feet to the fire and also to rally support behind that initiative, to give our politicians the political ability to institute that change. And that's the difficult part of this, is sometimes if politicians bring out an idea too early, before we've galvanized the community, an idea can come out and it's immediately quashed because it was too soon. So I'd encourage everyone in this room, you're all leaders here, I recognize many people who have been holding governments to account for a long, long time and having successes. Took far too long in terms of LGBTQ rights, but really look at how they looked like you were pushing up a rock up a hill until about 2008 that started to change. But that was from relentless work and effort, from uncomfortable conversations and putting yourself out there. So sometimes you got to help us because we can't lead from too far out in front.
Brad.
If I could on this topic, I agree with that. And one of the areas that we did a little bit of work with the great support of Momentum here in the city was on the small dollar short-term credit in the payday loan industry. And with the support of the mayor and many others, we got involved with a group of other Calgarians to backstop a new loan product at First Calgary Financial. And then with Momentum's introduction, ended up getting ATB involved. And it was that original impetus, not of just stopping at conversation and conversation and conversation, but actually just getting involved with kind of an innovative approach to catalyze the government to action. And the provincial government under Minister McLean was able to change the payday lending legislation in Alberta ahead of many other provinces. We stopped payday lending in this province. Not by just having crucial conversations, but going to the next step, as suggested by the mayor, about doing something. And when that something didn't work, we did something else. And when that something didn't work, we did something else. And then finally, legislation changed. And so I think one of the challenges that the mayor is laying down is around innovation. So this issue, this public health issue that I sit here and listen directly from Nathan on, about the incidence of TB and the incidence of suicide in these communities. We can have a conversation about that, or we can mobilize with a little bit of capital and a little bit of instruction from someone like Nathan and get to work on a 5-year project to fix that. And that can involve government, but it doesn't have to. I mean, if we feel passionately as a group in this room, and I have no beef with anyone that's not here. I mean, it's pointless to use this beautiful forum here to say, how come there's not other people here? It's great who's here. And there should be enough will and enough capital and enough energy to take on this specific challenge and to say, why can't we in 5 years fix this public health abomination of the incidence of TB and suicide with or without government? It just involves capital and effort and getting started. And I would think partway along that journey as citizens, as Canadians working on something like that we would be joined by other government, and in a way they would be spurred to action, much like Kent Heer is recommending here. So I just think we can move past conversation to action. You provided the forum for those conversations to start, and capital can start to flow, and we can just get busy on some of these things, not just talking about them.
You're being very characteristically modest, Brad, because of course the challenge we had with the payday loans and the short-term lending is that we could not convince the financial institutions that they weren't going to lose their shirts on promoting decent credit for low-income people. So what did you do? Brad Zumwalt freaking wrote a check and said, I'm going to prove this, and I'm going to help these folks, and I'm going to prove that there's a business model here, and it worked. But I think that that is one of the most important things that we need to understand, is that that culture of experimentation, that culture of trying things, and importantly, that culture of failure is something that is really important for our institutions to understand. You know, I've been saying for many, many years in my own work to my own colleagues at the city, go ahead and fail. Take risks. I want you to be less risk averse. And the minute they make a mistake, what happens? They stand in front of council, and 14 of us, 15 of us, including me, yell at them about it. And so we have got to figure out how we gain, and this is directly to Kent's point, how we gain public acceptance for risk-taking, for trying different things, for moving public things. Because the one thing I worry about the most is that all of the gains that we've made, and I'm using a value statement here very, very deliberately. You know, I'm not a particularly left-wing guy. I'm not a particularly right-wing guy. I wear purple every day because it's red and blue. And I try to be pragmatic in my thinking. But I do think we've made enormous gains as a society. The best example, of course, is the LGBTQ2S+. Can I just say sexual diversity? Because that's
Sure.
okay? The moves we've made on sexual and gender diversity in our community. And it feels like we have won. It feels like we should just plant the flag. This stuff is so fragile. And if we've learned anything in the last 2 years about the hardening of public discourse around the world, if we've learned anything about the rise of voices of anger and bitterness and hate and division that we've seen even here in our own community, we've learned how incredibly fragile that is.
Yes.
And how we got to step out and we got to support people like Natan and Pam and Brad in the work that they do. You know, I got to step out and say, you know, it's about more than the name of a football team. It's about who we are, and the stuff you're saying makes a ton of sense. And you need that support from guys like me, I think, as well as from your own community, in order to be able to do that. But all of us have to do it, not just those of us who get the Janet Jackson headset and get to sit and talk to people that way. Every single one of us has got to use our voice. You know, very, very quickly, you know, I've made a terrible mistake politically that I'm living with the results of right now. And that is that if I wanted to cook up a great deal for the Calgary 26 Olympics, I could have cooked up an amazing deal. And I could have come back to the citizens of Calgary and to my council a few months from now and say, look at this amazing deal, let's have a plebiscite and vote on it. And 2 years ago, I said, we're going to do this differently than any other city has ever done it. And we're actually going to open up the conversation and the sausage making and every dirty step in this process to public scrutiny. We're going to go back to my council over and over and over again and check their comfort level and make sure they're okay. And politicians told me I was insane for doing this. And guess what? I may lose the whole thing as a result of it. The reason I'm raising this is because what the process we're going through did by saying stay neutral, respect the process, trust the process, it meant that we took out the voices that were championing our transformative opportunity. The politicians, including me, muted ourselves because we're respecting the process. That created a giant vacuum for the naysayers and the haters and the angry people to come and fill the vacuum. And regardless of what you think about the Olympics, it's a beautiful example of how you screw up public discourse. And I would argue that citizens as a whole, not just politicians and people with headsets, have the opportunity to fix that by fixing discourse in all of our daily interactions, online, offline. I always say online or in line at the Tim Hortons, but we're not doing it.
Matt?
I wanted to touch on a couple of points that have been made, one about courageous discourse and the other about shame, and tied in with the remarks you just made around the way in which all this work gets done. Also, that resilience can have negative connotations or definitions as well. And the resilience of racism is very prevalent in this country. And part of that feeds into entertainment and sports entertainment, minor hockey or minor sports across this country, and the idea of mascots, the idea of indigenous mascots. There is no other ethnicity in this country that is subjected to other ethnicities other people taking on their ethnicities as a mascot or as an emblem. It doesn't exist in other. Perhaps if there was a very specific Irish community and you wanted to call yourselves the Fighting Irish and Irish people were the ones that created that name, go for it. That's amazing. Be proud of your identity. But if you're a part of a colonizing group of people that then take on Indigenous peoples as your mascot for your entertainment, that is not okay anymore. And this is a perfect example of the resilience of racism, that people don't see it as racism. People see it in all sorts of different convoluted ways, like that you're holding up and being proud of these Indigenous people that you know nothing about. What has happened, and what has happened in Edmonton, is over 100 and some years, there is a complete departure from the name of that team and what it actually is, that I am the emblem or the mascot of the Edmonton team. I am. And the idea of what a mascot is, that you rally around it, you're excited about it, it is yours. You can be the Eagles, you can be the Golden Bears, you can be these things, and you then have an association with that. It's not that you actually want to care about Golden Bears or care about Eagles. You've created a community. And the fact that now Indigenous peoples are saying, this is not what should happen in 2018, is something that people can't handle because of the fact that it was okay before. Is a person now going to be ashamed of all the years they wore a shirt or they cheered and screamed at the game? No, I don't think that has to happen. Just like all sorts of other changes in society towards good, things happen that were unacceptable before that are acceptable now. The women's right to vote, Indigenous people's right to vote, acceptance of the LGBTQ community. We take these steps in society, but in this particular case, it is just so strange to me that it gets opened up to polls, that people want to have a conversation about it, that people seek out the people in our community that are okay with this, and then lift them up as instead of accepting that even one Indigenous person that says this is a completely disrespectful and racist thing that continues to happen in this country is enough to say, okay, we need to change this.
Adrian, we do have a couple of people who'd like to contribute.
I think just one point Sure. I'd like to make as a result of Naden's intervention, and that is that we have to have those changes because we know better. That's all. Mm-hmm. People just say we know better now, and we are not infantilizing a group of people because it's easier to deal with them if we just think of them as something that we can name something for. And I think that's a process that we have to go through, and it should be fought very well. And I think you've got a lot of allies there. Just keep talking about it. I think it's very important, and I think it's important to all of us as Canadians. But the idea of racism and racialism and caring about other people and so on, we live in a very privileged bubble in many ways in Canada. We talk about our problems here, and we do have a lot of them, and periodically awful, ugly things happen. But, listening to you all talking about how you rallied together in 2008 and 13 for the flood and how people asked after it, makes me think that the year before 2013, in 2012, there was a monstrous heat wave in France. Probably remember that. And the temperature went up, to very, very high temperatures in the summer, and in Paris particularly. And as a result of that, although we may not have paid much attention to it or wonder why it happened, over 14,000 people over the age of 65 died. How did they die? Did they burn up? Did something happen where the sprinkling system flooded them? What happened to them? No, they died of neglect. because they're older, poor people who lived on the 6th floor of apartment buildings in Paris. When you go to Paris, one of the 70 million tourists a year who go to Paris, making it the major tourist destination in the world, and you see those beautiful 6-story apartment buildings, and you think, oh, those lovely little roofs, those darling little windows. Behind all those windows live older people, especially in half the arrondissements in Paris. They go up by stairs, and nobody asked during the heat waves, what is happening to those people? Is anyone bringing them food or water or checking on them? No, nobody was. So they died. And they just died. Nobody ever asked. And it was, and then afterwards people said, oh, that's awful. That's a terrible thing to have happened. But nobody thought this was an inhuman thing and we must completely change this, we must change ourselves, etc. This is not the way in which people were going to reprimand the French or say, we're not going to go to there anymore because you behaved like that towards people. That's simply not in their DNA to do the kinds of things which we in Canada have done, mainly because we come out of different roots in this country. We have been cruel and colonizing and done all sorts of things, but in terms of the way in which we now look at each other, or are trying to at least look at each other, we have got a little bit of a head start, even though we must deal with what we have done so wrongly in the past with Indigenous people. So just to put that, because Calgary does not exist in a little bubble, Alberta does not exist in a bubble, you're part of a world. Mm-hmm. We're part of a whole world that is dealing with the huge movements of people. This is only the beginning of the movements of people that we're going to see coming because they need to, because there's food shortage, there's water shortage, all that sort of thing. And we are going to be pressed for that. And we have to deal with it in a way which is real, not only with our institutions as we started this conversation, but with ourselves too, and how we deal with it personally, because it is a worldwide thing. And when you see how well certain countries have behaved, like Greece, where they had nothing, their whole economy was falling into the ground, and yet in these little islands, of population 1,000 people, they would take 300 people from boats and lodge them for a winter, build houses for them, because they themselves, as they said, their mayors said, I went to a conference of mayors of Greece, and they said, we couldn't let people who had just come to our shores like that not live the way we could. We couldn't just leave them there. And it's cold in the Mediterranean in the winter. It's not palm trees. It's cold. And they were able to cope and do that. And I think we have to keep ourselves going, too, in thinking, we've done well up to now. Can we keep going? Can we keep doing what we have done in the past? And that's what the challenge is. And that's what our challenge is to ask our institutions, what we ask of our institutions.
Adrienne, we're at the 30-minute mark. We have 30 minutes left. And it'd be lovely to include a few more people and then maybe bring it back into the group. Yeah. We're talking about how to change the conversations about towards resiliency. I have a woman here, and then I think I noticed, Marty, someone there. A couple people. Please stand.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Larson. Thank you, Adrienne, and for all of you for this amazing day today and very compelling conversation. I think we, as a community, there's two things that I would like to comment on and maybe puzzle around. The first one is about shame and stigma, specifically. The second one, I'd like to come back to resilience. In terms of shame and stigma, I agree that as a community, we responded very well to the 2013 flood and saw a lot of elements that demonstrate that we are a resilient city and that we can respond to a crisis. But when stigma is applied on top of that, I would say that we're not doing so well. In fact, yeah, we might be doing better in some respects, but we are also a city that is okay with knowing what is happening in the north and knowing what is happening in our own, right around the confluence of the Elbow and the Bow. And that is that we are okay with 3,200 people sleeping outside of a home every night. We are okay with almost 2 people dying every day in our province due to the opioid poisoning epidemic that has not been mentioned at all, except maybe in some of the smaller tables. And that is a true crisis as much as the 2013 flood ever was. Mm-hmm. And if only everybody would gather at McMahon Stadium to address the opioid poisoning crisis, I think that I would feel like I could say I live in a resilient community. We are okay with dropping people who have been discharged from the Calgary Correction Centre, for example, or the Remand Centre, and dropping them. I'm going to cry. Sorry, I always cry, but it's because I feel strongly that we need to show our vulnerability in order to have a real, transparent conversation about this. Dropping off somebody from corrections on Christmas Day, minus 29 degrees. 30-year-old gentleman who was incarcerated because of tickets to lose his left hand to frostbite. We are okay with that. So while I am so proud and amazed to be part of this day and hopeful, I am really needing to say we are not there yet. So my second point is about resilience, and then I'll wrap up. Resilience in a community requires that we take care of each other. And I am a family doctor, and I work on the front lines downtown with the most vulnerable of our vulnerable Calgarians. And I would say that part of my role as a doctor is to advocate for my patients. That means that I have to hold institutions' feet to the fire. That's part of my job. And I do that every day in this way and other ways. And what I would say that in terms of resilience, I find that exhausting because it's always me knocking on your door. And it's not you coming to me and saying, what do you need downtown? What do you need under the bridge when you see a patient there? What do you need our help with? It's never that. It's always us knocking up on your door saying, hey, we're struggling down here. Or we're struggling I've been in Joe Haven, and it's the same thing. You're in Joe Haven and saying, help, like you're screaming underwater. And that isn't resilience to me. I think institutions need to come down to us, those of us who are doing the work on the front line, and say, how can we help? That, to me, will build resilience in our community.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, the last lady, for everything that you just said, but your compassion. It's beautiful and inspiring. I was an athlete. I'm a white woman, heterosexual, married to a beautiful man. I am not a marginalized person. I've been successful in everything I've tried to do. So I'm speaking from a place of absolute privilege, and I think it's important to acknowledge that when you're speaking. And what I want to share today is a recent experience. Last week, I had a friend who is this wonderful man, very outspoken in the LGBTQ community. He is a force. He speaks loud, he speaks proud for his community. And my friend, he posted something on Instagram from the cold, cold winter storm in Quebec, and it said, I'm not going to say the E word. It said, E-ready. And I'm going back to what you just spoke about, Natan, about the football team in this province. And I didn't know what to do seeing this, but I knew that I know this is wrong. But how do I tell this person that I don't think is speaking from a bad place, but has deeply offended so many of the people that I know, because I have been up to Nunatsiavut, to Nunavut, to Nunavik, to Inuvialuit, to all of the Inuit communities and the friendships that I've had and made there, and the respect that I try to maintain in everything I say and do to these communities and the people that I get to call friends. And so what I did was I wrote a private message to this awesome man, and I said, first of all, I love you. Secondly, I need to tell you you're wrong. And I told him why. Not my definition of why, but why the word he used was incorrect and wrong and actually offensive to the point of racist. I didn't explain from my white privileged perspective why it was wrong. I posted an article that Natan was interviewed for about that football team in Edmonton. And I said, if you really want to know why, please read this. He wrote me back within 2 seconds and said, the post is down. He wrote me back 10 minutes later and said, I read the article. I can't believe I didn't know this was wrong. I feel like such a jerk. Thank you. So that I'm saying this because there's something we can all do in a respectful way, in a non-shaming, judgmental way. We can share the things that we've learned and not speak for other people or peoples, but we can hopefully bring us all to a better level of respect and understanding and human to human coexistence. That's it.
You know, I try to live my life every day with a simple rule, WWCD, what would Clara do? That's what you should do.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Sohail. You know, I'm here. I'm optimistic, and I'm happy to be here. But I feel like a lot of the challenges that we're speaking of, they're seeds that may not affect or show any fruit in our life, to be very honest with you. Just for the fact that I feel like we talk about these institutions that should change, and we talk about these countries and these lines, and these things are deeply entrenched structures that have been here for hundreds of years. So these things don't change overnight. So in my opinion, the way I see our society, even growing up in Calgary, I was born and raised here, I feel like our society and the way media, news, teachers, institutions, the way they teach us, it's an individual society. It's all about me. I have to get an education. I need to get a good job. I need to get married. I need to get a house. It's never, and I feel throughout history, it may have shifted at some point where we used to worry about other people, communities. And when our panelists are speaking about people dying in France and all these atrocities going on around the world, in my mind, of course, nobody cares about it. Because from birth, they weren't taught to care about other people. They were always taught to care about themselves first. And a solution or something that I'd like to discuss is changing that mindset, like from legislation to teachers to in the home. Like all of our institutions, like Mayor Nenshi said, are built of people. If we as people don't decide or entrench in our children from a young age that, you know, you need to worry about other people more, if not more than yourself, then how can they ever change to care enough to do anything? And yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Adrian, if we have time for maybe just one or two more, and then you might want to finish with the group, because we're down to about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And I have a lady here, and then Marty has one, and that'll be our final two interventions. And I just want to thank everybody. Those were very powerful.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evelyn Goodstriker. And listening to you, I was just thinking, well, yeah, we get mad. But if we get mad and we speak up, we get blackballed, or we get put down, or we, you know, even as a woman, that's what's happened to me. But what I want to say is that there are enough of our people in places. I wouldn't say enough. There are more and more people of our places in positions where they can speak, where they can have power to do things, to make changes. But we still have gatekeepers And our gatekeepers are still, we still feel like we're being colonized on a daily basis. We still feel like there's racism, discrimination, all of that still holds us down. We can't really rise up. I was at a conference in October in Calgary here, and we had Michelle Thrush and Eugene Braverock speaking. And they talked about, it's time. If you're learning about the TRC and the 94 recommendations, it's time for the public, mainstream. If we have positions, let us lead. Let us go forward as Indigenous people, because we know the way, we know the answers. For many years, programs, agencies delivered to us think, oh, this is good for the Indian, this is good for the First Nations, let's implement it. It never works. We know what is good for ourselves. We know what's good for our people. So let us lead. Get out of the way. Okay? The other thing I want to say is we've all acknowledged governments. We're allowed to vote now. I learned about this in 1963 in my community. But in my little community, we thought that we had a good leader who we thought that would lead a better life. And a lot of us Indigenous people voted this government in. My little community is still boiling water for 30 years. Still boiling water. If you know about Cindy Blackstock, she's been fighting two federal governments, and she wants justice for our children, equality for our children in children's services and education. And so they're still not listening to her. They're spending millions of dollars fighting her. And it should be a no-brainer, right? But that's what happens to our people, and that's how our people are being treated right now. So if we want to really learn about TRC and the 94 recommendations, let's start with looking at ourselves and what we know and what we don't know. And there's lots I don't know. I still have to learn a lot, and we all do. Thank you.
I'm Erin Kelly with the Calgary Sexual Health Centre, and I'm just very honored to be here today. And I just really want to thank Clara for sharing your story. I think that we are having these challenging conversations. I see them every day in the work that we do. And it's great to look around this room. I see people from government, people from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector, all doing really important work. And my question to the panelists, what do you think we can do to continue to mobilize as a community cross sectors? I think what happens often is we all go back to our work in nonprofit or government or wherever it may be with great intentions, but it's difficult to get us working together across sectors. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
We don't have much time to have all of that. I just want to put in something here, which is about reading and rereading of things. Many of you may remember that I started the Fifth Estate 100 years ago, and there were two of us who were the co-hosts, and we fought for stories always. We'd go to story things and we'd say, we can bring this to that story. I have this point of view on it. We had a wonderful time always. And one of the stories, there were two stories up for grabs. One was about the crash of the Pan-Arctic plane with people from Yellowknife and a bunch of oil people on it that had not been properly probed. And the other one was about bad water at Grassy Narrows Reserve, which was on the Manitoba-Ontario border. And I drew the straw for the Pan-Arctic, which I was very glad about because I won an award about. But the Grassy Narrows story went to somebody else. 2 months ago, I opened the Globe and Mail, and there is a story that says, bad water at Grassy Narrows. It has been exactly 42 years since that came up as a story to be done on the Fifth Estate. What is going on? Why is there bad water at Grassy Narrows still? And that's what, that's the frustration, and that's why you can understand the frustration leading to rage about the lack of change, even though so much seems to be happening. I think those of us who are not involved on a day-to-day basis in these questions wonder, why isn't progress being made? Why why are we still hearing about this? Why is there boil water on something? Why do we have these rates? Why is this happening? And that is what's causing an enormous amount of frustration, and eventually people kind of tune out who are not directly involved with it because they say, oh, same old thing, same old thing. But your comments to any of the last, I think we have this to wrap up. We have a few comments that you could think about making while we're talking to each other. I'm going to knock on you first, Pam.
So this morning in the first session that I facilitated, my takeaway from that time, the roundtable this morning and this afternoon, I think for me more and more and what I think about in the whole world is our need for connection, our basic human need for connection. And I believe every moment of my life that all of us want to be seen, heard, and understood. And I think if we could get to a place where we really believed that, to the speaker behind me, where we really believed the value of doing that, that we would get a lot further, a lot faster. And the second thing I believe, in partly to answer Aaron's question, is social innovation is a thing. And I think right now it's a bit of a workaround, but I think it will become a substantial part of the way we run community. People like Brad and Nahed and me working together, bring Nathan in, we could probably change quite a bit. And we wouldn't need government, we just need good ideas, people behind it, and listening to the people who are affected. And I think social change can happen a lot faster. So, I mean, I think in so much of, like, root is the word that I come back to. If we look at the roots of who we are, and what we need to do to change things, I think we could actually more easily succeed.
I totally believe that. One of the little ways in which I try to do that about the connecting with people, of course, you know, I've done it professionally in this kind of way since I was 4 years old, but it's basically that I talk to everybody that talks to me.
Yes.
If I'm in a position where I can, not if I'm running down the street to catch the bus or going to try to work my Presto card on the Toronto Transit Commission, which isn't working, but.
Don't say that. It costs $1.4 billion.
Yes, I know. That's why I just thought I'd throw that in case somebody would mention it somewhere. But I like to talk to everybody. Somebody comes up to me, because of course they recognize me, and they say hello. If I'm sitting down at the subway or whatever, I always talk to everybody who talks to me, because I always learn something. I always learn something, and that is the whole meaning of being a human being, is that you relate to other human beings. Otherwise, we wouldn't relate to other human beings by speech. If we're animals, you relate to them by smell, by walking around them, by pawing the same ground. They do other things. But as human beings, that's the one thing we have, is we can look at each other and have speech. Yes. And so it is always important to just exercise that every single time. Absolutely. Make a connection with somebody and make that connection a real one. And it's a terribly important thing to do, I think, for everyone and anyone. Not just somebody who looks really, really interesting, but anyone. That's right. You know, I really believe in that very much. Nan?
A few things.
Can I just throw in something that negative? Sure. I think it's really, really important with Indigenous peoples, and particularly the Inuit, because there are languages there and so on, that the survival, because you're going to get beyond survival and you're going to get to really booming, is a cultural survival. So the importance of the language in that, the importance of everything that makes you what you are as a people, are you able to emphasize that enough for the future, that the culture is being kept alive?
It's a lot that I want to say. I'm going to try to get through a few things. First, the question over here about what we can do as organizations together. I think the first thing is a principle that we don't need to actually collaborate with in real time would be to ensure that when you take on new responsibilities, when you occupy a space within the mandate of your institutions or organizations, that you do it in respect of all other organizations around you that form a larger network. That you don't actively try to take the space of something that already exists, or don't try to take the voice of Indigenous peoples just because you have the opportunity to get funding to do something, or just because your board has said that they want to go in that direction. The respect that we have for each other as stewards or shepherds of institutions is also human in the way in which how you want to be treated is also the way that others want to be treated as well. As far as our culture and the linchpin that it is for our self-determination, there's a couple of stories I can think of right off the top of my head. The first is around how knowledge is transferred, how we have the conversation. I've been very fortunate to be able to facilitate conversations in Nunavut and in Nunatsiavut about things like the creation of a poverty strategy or a food security strategy, essential building blocks for a better society. And when you get certain voices in the room, you want them to speed up. Like an elder who wants to talk about food security, and they start with a story about their childhood and talking about what it was like to fish in a certain river. And you can tell that a lot of people in the room are kind of fidgeting in their seats and hoping that this guy just gets on with it. And what does this have to do with anything? We're here to talk about policy. But in the Inuit perspective, especially in the traditional perspective, it's an oral tradition. It's an oral way of communicating information. So he's just not answering the question about food security policy. He is passing on knowledge about how you fish, about the places that you have to protect, the ideology about what it is to be human and what it is that you value in order to then have food for your family. And often we aren't able to have respect for other cultures and other ways of talking. So that is, I think, an essential part of resilience for Canada, is to try to figure out how to create spaces where we can get beyond our immediate reaction, which is just hurry up and get to the point. Or in some cases, some people come to it hot, like they come in fired up and angry, and being able to say, this is maybe a cultural perspective. This is something that is the way in which they have grown up and interact with others within their society. The second and associated point is a story about me as a young man being proud of having skills to go on the land in my hometown, and almost bragging to an elder one day.
Which is Nain, which is as far north as you can get in Labrador.
And saying, I'm going to go caribou hunting this weekend. It's pretty innocuous. I was trying to prove a point that I could go caribou hunting, that I knew the land well enough to go on a skidoo and find the animals and to harvest them. And his initial response was, if the weather is okay. And the point was, and you'll hear this with Inuit that you talk to, that we don't say things in certainty. We don't say, and especially from a traditional society, because everything is predicated on the situation in the moment. Everything's predicated on the environment. Our lives depended upon us being able to be adaptable in the moment and to not have our heart set on something that we had to have at all cost. That we adapted in the moment. And so for the way in which we speak to one another and the way in which I was trying to say, I can do something, he was saying, no, you can do something if the conditions are right. If things fall into place, and if nature and if the environment allows for you to do that, then that is something that you could probably do. I think that is also just a fundamentally different way of looking at achieving goals, at how we go about achieving those goals, that has some real relevance here. What can we achieve together in this moment, in this environment? Not, this is the thing that we have to do. I think that's a really key point that from Inuit culture to all of us that we can take some stock from.
Brad?
Wow, well said. In thinking about all this and pulling together some of the things, I asked at the beginning, do we understand what the vision is? And it doesn't have to be a single overarching thing. Some of the stories that we heard from our city about opioids and homelessness and being released from prison, any one of those can be something we can have a vision against. And even any of the 16 can be something that we can have a vision against. And what the mayor reminded us, if we're going to reach for things like that as citizens, and we should, then there's going to be failures. And so we can't say we're going to fix this opioid thing this fast. We also are going to have to wait for the weather to be okay. But the resilience that we need is to hold firm to that goal, and as we get knocked down, to keep coming back as citizens and doing that. And it's going to take new ways of doing things. We live in a pace of innovative change that's unlike anything we've ever seen before. And so maybe a simple test is if we're approaching these new problems in the same way that we would have approached them 10 years ago, with institutions that run the same way that they ran 10 years ago, we're probably going to get the results that we got 10 years ago. So to Pam's point about innovation is we have to look for different ways to go at these things. I believe our city needs us to figure out different ways to do those things and de-risk some of those ways and then pass them off to the people at the good institutions that intend to do well for us. And I think there's something that we can do in Calgary to support all of this. We see it in the startup community. It's very common for someone involved in a small business or growing business not only to have that day job that they have, but to have a side hustle. And so from a social perspective, what's the side hustle that you could have heard about today that you can lend a hand on and jump into, and you can really get educated very quickly, as we did in this little payday lending project, with the support of the organizations that are already serving that. And I think the question that this forum brings us to is if we want Calgary to be a place that's better for these little voices running around this place that we hear today, how are you, as a citizen here, allocating your time differently than you allocated it last year to make a better outcome for the city? How are you allocating your money, any amount philanthropically or investment capital? And most importantly, to Pam's point, how are you allocating the connections that you have? Because that's, I think, where you really show your trust and love for the city, is if you're willing to say, well, I know Pam and she can help you with this, and if she hears that I introduced us, then she would be happy to help that out. I mean, in this crazy Facebook testimony that would be going on today, remember the numbers in that thing talk about a ratio of about 185. They started buying, I think, 270,000 names. That blew up to a $50 million name problem on that Facebook thing. And the point is, there's a multiple there of 185 times. So to make this city work, I think we should all be striving to have 185 quality connections that we can help each other with, as opposed to connections that can be used for bad purposes. But I think if we ask those questions of ourselves, we get towards the goals that you're talking about here around diversity.
You know, Adrian, you asked earlier, do you get mad? And I never answered that question. And when I came here today, I was super mad. I get super mad a lot. And those of you who are from Calgary know sometimes I get super mad in front of a TV camera or at council chambers. And then I get to sit here for 75 or 90 minutes with 4 of my great Canadian heroes and role models. 3 I know very well, 1 I've admired from afar for a long time. And I'm still mad. But what I'm mad about, and I hope that it's exactly what Brad was saying, is that, yeah, sometimes it is tough. You're knocking on that damn door, and nobody is answering the door. You're thinking about those 17 things, and you're thinking about every single way in which we're failing on equality and clean water and energy and renewables and everything else. You get mad about the way you're being treated. You get mad about the fact that you're not being listened to. You get mad at the media. We never get mad at the media, do we, Kent? We get mad at the media. And then I listen to Bonnie, to Dr. Larson, and I hear that anger and that frustration. And you know what? She bloody goes to work every day. And even when I was on the outside knocking on that door for so long, for so much of my life, now I'm on the inside, and I still feel like I'm knocking on other people's doors all the time, she's still knocking on the door. And without that kind of work, would we have built Canada's second supervised consumption site here in Calgary and just got her done? Would we have saved over 95 people from overdose in the first couple of months? No, not without that work. So much as I wish that I was omnipotent and I knew everything, and those who work with me will say, but he is omnipotent, he does know everything, right? No, they will never say that. I need you to keep knocking on the door. And I need you to bang on that door hard and say, we're here and this is what's happening. And I need to keep knocking and banging on those doors. And every one of us, I think, has the opportunity and the chance to do that. So I'm going to do something incredibly presumptuous. And I'm going to say, so you heard what Clara did. That is exactly what we need to do, but now she has to do the next step. So my presumptuous thing is I'm giving you homework. Because you did it right. You contacted the person privately. You said, I love you, but, right? But now we have to tell the story without embarrassing or shaming that person. So now the next step is take a selfie with him, put it on your own Instagram, and tell that story without naming the person, obviously, because that's how we move the conversation. Because if we get mad and angry and crawl up under our desks in the fetal position, which I've been wanting to do so bad all week, it's not quite big enough, that desk. I've tried. We don't keep the struggle. We don't keep the path going towards maintaining those gains and getting more gains. Because ultimately, we have a silent flood every single day. We got a silent flood of homelessness and of poverty, of environmental justice, of economic empowerment, of people dying before their time because they're isolated and they see no hope in their lives. And I ask myself every single day, how do I get the McMahon Stadium? How do I get that power and resilience of humanity that comes together in a time of natural crisis and comes together to come together on those silent floods every day? And I can do some of it. And I work with great people every day who can do some of it. But you've heard me say this many, many times if you ever heard me speak. It's not me. It's everyday people with our everyday hands and our everyday voices knocking on that door every single day. And that's what this is about. That's what this community is about. So don't complain about who's not here, like Brad said. Go out and talk to them as soon as you leave.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. It's been marvelous. Thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you, Natan, Pam, Brad, and Naheed, and of course, Madam Clarkson. Another round of applause for this incredible panel, and to all those who participated in making it what it was.